What do you want us to do? What should Congress do? I can't legislate bad behavior to stop it. Just quickly, what would you do?
Thank you for asking this question, actually, because I think it's very important due to the fact that multiple members of the committee has now said that this is not the appropriate venue for us to be sharing this story and that we should be in the courtroom, things like that. You guys have the opportunity to take this issue on, pass legislation that would help other employees throughout the United States be able to report so they have that opportunity to be in the courtroom. And not only the opportunity to be in the courtroom, but then also to find some justice. Because I think we can all agree that a lot of people go through the criminal justice system and they never see any type of justice when it comes to sexual harassment or sexual assault. So until those two things are taken more seriously by Congress, then nothing is going to happen. But that's why we're here today, to ask you to do your job and pass those legislation laws.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 268th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today, the day of this episode's release, is Super Bowl Sunday, which might be my favorite American holiday. But today, I'm feeling the need to repent. Because in the last episode, the episode about Live Nation and Ticketmaster, I confessed that I am an NFL season ticket holder. And the main reason for that is that I love American football, and I have since I was a wee child. I love the choreography of it. I love the plays, basic and trick, and watching how the other teams respond to them. I love that football is a true team sport. You know, like one guy can have the best game of his life and it won't make a damn bit of difference if the rest of his teammates don't do their part. I love the complicated rules, of which there are so many, and how knowing them is a source of pride as a fan. Because I love playing armchair referee. You know, that shoe had green all around it. That was in. That's a touchdown. And then I love the instant gratification of the verdict when New York makes the call within a minute or two of the controversy. And more than anything, I love having something to root for. I love having something totally inconsequential, a game to get excited about. I love high-fiving strangers who are wearing Patriots or Raiders gear, because the Patriots are my favorite team, but I do have Raiders season tickets. I love the roar of the crowd when something good or even when something bad happens to my team. I was at the Patriots-Raiders game this past December and had perfect seats for viewing every nightmare second of the dumbest Patriots play of all time. And if you know, you know. But if you don't know and want to, I've included a video of that moronic play set to Titanic music in the show notes for you. It was so dumb. But even though that play made sure that the Patriots lost a guaranteed trip to overtime, and they lost their chance to go to the playoffs with that stupidity, it was really fun as a fan to be there, to share that misery in person. Like when the old chowderhead that was sitting next to me, who hadn't said a word to me all game, looked me dead in the eye and said, "What the f*** was that?" The whole collective moan, which was also being drowned out by the joyous squeals of the Raiders fans. I even loved it when my husband, dressed head to toe in Raiders silver and black, snapped a picture of my pissed off face, which of course Justin Robert Young shared with the entire internet. It's all so dumb, and it's all so much fun. I love being a professional football fan. But being a professional football fan in the United States, going to games and especially being a season ticket holder, means supporting the organization that has a monopoly on professional football teams in this country, the National Football League, the NFL. And supporting this league too many times has felt like a sin. And so this episode is my repentance. Because last year, the sins of the NFL team owners were so brazen and obvious that Congress got involved and held a year-long investigation into the sexual misconduct that was apparently rampant in the team representing our nation's capital city, the Washington, D.C. Commanders. They also investigated the response, or lack thereof, of the NFL to the many, many problems at the Washington Commanders team. And so in this episode, I'm going to play highlights of testimony for you from 2 congressional hearings. The first hearing featured testimony about the sexual misconduct within the team management, specifically the owner of the team, Dan Snyder. And then the second hearing featured the top guy at the NFL, Roger Goodell, and you're going to hear his testimony about the NFL's response. But this episode isn't just about the NFL. So stick around, because while researching this episode, I discovered that these hearings were harder to find than they should have been. And it wasn't just these hearings. Hearings that took place in the last Congress are being deleted from government websites. Now, luckily, these hearings that I was trying to watch for this episode were high profile enough that C-SPAN cameras were in the rooms, and so I was able to access them via C-SPAN. But as we learned in my interview with C-SPAN's communications director, Howard Mortman, C-SPAN's reach is limited. They're not recording every hearing. Their archive is incomplete and is going to remain incomplete. And so we need to talk about the official government archive, because we have a big problem with how that is being managed. And that problem directly affects you, at least if you value the sources I provide for you in the show notes of every Congressional Dish episode, because some of those sources are now gone. So this episode really is a twofer, half NFL investigation and half congressional dysfunction. But seeing as this is Super Bowl Sunday, an ass-grabbing party hosted by Dan Snyder, owner of the Redskins, who are now named Commanders because their first name was so racist. Redskins. Oh, man. Yes, that's the team that has represented the capital of the United States since 1937. Although, since I am about repentance here, and I am an unapologetic lover of all things Boston's, I do have to admit that the name Redskins was actually invented in the city where this team was originally created, which was my beloved Boston. But the team was only in Boston for 5 years before it moved to our nation's capital. And that's where it kept the name Redskins for the next 83 years, which was not a great look. But you can't really blame the city of Washington, D.C. for keeping that name. The fans in the cities generally have no say in what the NFL teams do. NFL teams, while appearing to represent various cities around the country, are actually almost always owned privately by rich families or by small groups of rich families. The Green Bay Packers are the notable exception to this rule by the rich. When it comes to the Washington Redskins, 2 years after the owner Jack Kent Cooke died, Daniel Snyder, a communications industry millionaire, purchased the Washington, D.C. football franchise, outbidding the son of the previous owner whose family had owned the team for 25 years and had won 3 Super Bowls. But in the 23 years since that purchase, Dan Snyder's leadership has led the team to 0 Super Bowls and just 2 playoff game wins. His leadership has also led to a congressional investigation into rampant sexual misconduct at the Washington Redskins / football team / Commanders during his reign. It was actually only in the wake of the sexual misconduct scandals that Dan Snyder was finally pressured to change that name, going from racist to boring to militaristic, which is actually quite fitting for the team representing this particular nation's capital. But because their new name is the Commanders, I'm going to call them that from now on, even though football team was my favorite of their names, and even though most of this story took place while the Snyder family was still defiantly holding on to the Redskins logo. But reading from the committee's final report, which was released in December of 2022, quote, "The committee launched this investigation last October after the league failed to release detailed findings from an internal investigation by an attorney, Beth Wilkinson, who found that bullying and intimidation, sexual harassment, and a culture of fear pervaded the Commanders organization for many years, and that senior executives not only failed to stop it, but engaged in inappropriate conduct themselves. Despite acknowledging these alarming conclusions, the NFL refused to disclose the full scope of conduct or seek meaningful accountability, unquote. And so here's the most damning testimony provided to the committee, in my opinion at least, showing what exactly those accusations of bullying, intimidation, sexual harassment, and a culture of fear were based on. The testimony you're about to hear comes from a hearing that took place almost exactly a year ago on February 3rd, 2022, in the House Oversight and Reform Committee, which at the time was chaired by then Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York, who will introduce the witnesses to you in this montage.
Next, we will hear from Rachel Eagleson, who started as an intern for the Washington football team in 2010, and then became a customer service representative, a manager of premium client services, the director of marketing and client relations, and the director of client services from 2011 to 2019.
I was only 24, and the man who sexually harassed me was old enough to be my father, and he also was considered the voice of the team in the public sphere. So to me, the power that he held in his position and his close personal relationship with Dan Snyder was enough for me to reconsider anything. And at the time, I didn't know and realize that 55% of victims experience retaliation after speaking up or making a claim. I still decided to tell my boss about my harasser's public comments about my appearance, his unwanted kisses on the cheek, and the emails about special gifts he expected from me. When I told my boss, we agreed that nothing would happen if I reported it to the person who was supposedly running HR at that point. And so my boss called my harasser on the phone. Mind you, we were in two different locations. I was in Maryland and he was in Virginia, so this had to be done via phone call. I was in the room when my boss called him to tell him to leave me alone, and it's a memory I'll never forget because I distinctly remember hearing my harasser yell through the phone, "What the fuck is she thinking?" And I just kind of muted everything after that. So fearing further harassment and retaliation, I took to hiding from him at public events. I strategically would place myself between colleagues so he couldn't get near me. And I just felt humiliated to have to hide in plain sight in front of all of my colleagues, my clients, and I was just so frustrated that I had to avoid company functions for fear that I would experience sexual harassment again. And most of all, it made me feel worthless. All the hard work I put into my work and the team, and I was reduced to my appearance and not my value as an employee. The second time I decided to report harassment was with the arrival of a new executive team similar to Anna that was specifically hired to help change the business. I told them about the public comments about my appearance, the unwanted kisses on the cheek, the email, as well as the time at training camp I was sexually assaulted by the same man that I had previously reported. Those executives were appalled at my treatment and had good intentions to effect change, but they were all fired within 6 months of reporting this. And after they were fired, and this was reportedly because the old guard at the Washington football team did not want change, I just felt like I had zero protection. I didn't want to go back to avoiding people, clients, events, and even my own job to keep away from my harasser. So I resigned from my position without another job lined up so I wouldn't have to deal with this.
Our first participant is Melanie Coburn, who was a cheerleader for the Washington football team from 1997 to 2001, and was the director of marketing and marketing coordinator from 2001 to 2011.
Over the years, it became clear that Dan Snyder and his male executives were far too interested in the cheerleaders. Eventually, Dan himself had the final say of who made the team and who got months in the calendar. Unbelievably, he requested binders of photographs for auditions and the calendar so that he could choose who to cut based on looks, not talent. One year, he cut 10 veterans who otherwise would have made the team based on their skill and experience, evidently because they weren't the prettiest in his opinion. It was known as the Tyson's Massacre. At cheerleader auditions one year, Dan Snyder ordered the director of the squad to parade the ladies onto the field while he and his friends gawked from his suite through binoculars. The women were directed to turn around slowly, as if they were cattle being examined for sale. One of the women cried on the sidelines because she didn't understand what was happening. During calendar production one year, a male executive took unedited prints off the graphic designer's desk despite my warnings to protect them. One of these compromising full-size photos was one of the team's most loyal employees and my dear friend. She's sitting next to me today. I'm still haunted by this. And at the time, there was no HR department or any reporting mechanism for this abusive behavior.
Then we will hear from Tiffany Johnston, who was a cheerleader for the Washington football team from 2007 to 2008, and a marketing manager and marketing and events coordinator for club-level tickets from 2002 to 2008.
In the last couple of years, I learned that Dan Snyder, via a senior vice president, demanded my unedited enlarged lingerie calendar photo be sent to his office. I learned that this demand was made urgently because they knew that the graphic artist was getting ready to Photoshop my personal areas before the edited proof went before all of the senior VPs and Dan Snyder for approval. I learned on one specific occasion that when I was asked by my boss to attend a networking event, and to dress cute, it was actually an orchestration by him and Dan Snyder to put me in a compromising sexual situation. I learned that placing me strategically by the owner at a work dinner after this networking event was not for me to discuss business, but to allow him, Dan Snyder, to place his hand on my thigh under the table. I learned how to discreetly remove a man's unwanted hand from my thigh at a crowded dinner table at a busy restaurant to avoid a scene. I learned that job survival meant I should continue my conversation with another coworker rather than call out Dan Snyder right then in the moment. I also learned later that evening how to awkwardly laugh when Dan Snyder aggressively pushed me towards his limo with his hand on my lower back, encouraging me to ride with him to my car. I learned how to continue to say no, even though a situation was getting more awkward, uncomfortable, and physical. I learned that the only reason Dan Snyder removed his hand from my back and stopped pushing me towards his limo was because his attorney intervened and said, Dan, this is a bad idea. A very bad idea, Dan. I learned that I should remove myself from Dan's grip while his attorney was distracting him. I also learned at that moment, during an unspoken conversation between my boss and I, that my boss was not there to look out for me. He was there to listen to any directive his boss, Dan Snyder, had given to him at my cost. The next day I learned, when I told a senior coworker about Dan Snyder's sexual advance, that I should, quote, not repeat this story to anyone outside this office door. That was when I also learned there was no one to go to about Dan Snyder's advance, no path to report the incident, so I learned to move on.
Ms. Johnson, I received a letter dated today from Jason Friedman, a former vice president who worked for the Washington football team for over 20 years. And here is the letter. He was apparently with you the night that Dan Snyder personally harassed you. And here's what he said. He has never told his story publicly before, and I want to quote now from his letter. He says, I witnessed Dan Snyder grab the arm of my coworker, Tiffany Johnston, and attempt to pull her into his limousine. This took place over a dinner in Washington, D.C. I was shocked. Thankfully, Tiffany was able to quickly pull away.
I also think I should stop here to note that the then Washington Redskins secretly paid a former female employee $1.6 million to shut her up about Dan Snyder doing something to her while flying back from Las Vegas on Snyder's private jet. And I don't have any more details than that because the settlement included confidentiality clauses, as hush money generally does, and the team has fought the release of any details in federal courts. And so now that you know that, let's get back to the hearing. Here's former Commander's Director of Marketing and cheerleader, Melanie Coburn.
I felt compelled to come forward publicly when I read the second shocking Post article that revealed 2 lewd videos of the cheerleaders that were secretly created. I was physically ill when I read that piece. The Good Bits videos, produced at the behest of Dan Snyder, were secretly made from footage taken at our calendar shoots. We trusted the production team to capture footage and keep it safe. Little did we know they were zooming in on private parts and keeping cameras rolling during costume changes. I've cried with the women in these videos as they explain the horror of seeing themselves in what is essentially a soft porn video, soundtrack to Dan Snyder's favorite bands. These women remain traumatized.
Next, we will hear from Brad Baker, who was a producer at the Washington football team from 2007 to 2008 and a video production manager from 2008 to 2009.
In the early summer of 2008, a normal production meeting with the video department was wrapping up when Larry Michael, then executive producer of media and one of Snyder's top lieutenants, asked me and two other male producers to stay behind and shut the door. The female members of the department were dismissed. Larry Michael told us that the owner had a special project for us and needed us to edit together a video of the good bits from our cheerleader calendar video shoot. It wasn't hard to put two and two together. Larry Michael, one of Snyder's top confidants, has tasked us with producing a video for Snyder of sexually suggestive footage of cheerleaders, obviously unbeknownst to any of the women involved. One of the senior producers said he'd take care of it, and later on, while passing through the editing suite, I saw several images on both the editing monitor and the monitor of our tape deck that featured the cheerleaders posing for their photo shoot, but it was like outtakes, and their breasts and pubic areas were exposed. It became crystal clear that my worst suspicions were true. The video department had been told to edit together lewd footage of the cheerleaders at the request of Dan Snyder.
Dan Snyder rules by fear. We've seen Dan's vindictive rap for years, such as when he nearly bankrupted the Washington City paper for an unflattering article. He sent private investigators to the homes of a dozen former cheerleaders last year, and I got calls from these terrified women who didn't understand why PIs were showing up on their doorsteps. He offered hush money to a group of us in exchange for our silence last February, but we declined. This was offensive and certainly felt like intimidation and witness tampering to us.
Now, obviously, after that testimony, Congress had questions for Dan Snyder, and he was asked to testify. But this is what happened. Here's then chair of the committee, Carolyn Maloney, on June 22nd, 2022.
We also invited Daniel Snyder to testify today. But rather than show up and take responsibility for his actions, he chose to skip town. Apparently, Mr. Snyder is in France, where he has docked his luxury yacht near a resort town. Mr. Snyder has not been held accountable. His refusal to testify sends a clear message that he is more concerned about protecting himself than coming clean with the American people. If the NFL is unwilling or unable to hold Mr. Snyder accountable, then I am prepared to do so. That is why I am announcing now my intent to issue a subpoena for the testimony of Mr. Snyder for a deposition next week. The committee will not be deterred in its investigation to uncover the truth of workplace misconduct at the Washington Commanders.
Reading now from the committee's final investigation report, quote, Mr. Snyder sought to avoid service of a subpoena while abroad with his yacht. Mr. Snyder ultimately sat for a private deposition but failed to provide full and complete testimony. Over the course of the deposition, he claimed more than 100 times that he could not recall the answers to the committee's questions, including basic inquiries about his role as team owner and multiple allegations of misconduct, unquote. Which I guess isn't all that surprising. He does have the right, after all, to refuse to incriminate himself. What's more interesting, at least to me, in terms of punishment for these possible crimes, is what the NFL chose to do about it. Here's the commissioner of the NFL, the top guy, Roger Goodell, testifying to Congress on June 22nd of last year.
The Commanders are one of 32 NFL clubs, each of which is managed by its ownership and executives and have their own workplaces and policies. 2 years ago, the Commanders asked me to recommend independent counsel to address workplace issues and recommend changes to improve the workplace culture. We identified several candidates, and the club selected Beth Wilkinson, a distinguished former federal prosecutor. Approximately 6 weeks later, the club asked my office to assume oversight of the Wilkinson firm's work. The Wilkinson firm conducted a comprehensive review of the workplace at the club, interviewing more than 150 witnesses. As a result, we gained a clear understanding of what the workplace had been at the Commanders, how it had begun to change, and what further steps were needed to support our ultimate goal of transforming that workplace to one that is safe and productive for all of its employees.
But here's what happened to that report. This is Brad Baker. He is the former video producer at the Washington Commanders.
The NFL has refused to release the report of the Wilkinson investigation, even though myself and over 100 other employees were asked by the league to speak to the Wilkinson firm. We all participated because we thought the NFL wanted to know the truth. We believed that the toxic workplace culture and the serious harm it caused would finally become public and that the investigation would end with some kind of report. I mean, they were able to release a report that was 243 pages long, 243 pages long on the PSIs of footballs, the pounds per square inch of footballs. Surely, women being sexually harassed and lewd outtakes videos of females employees created without their consent could muster up some kind of written report, right?
And every single witness at the first hearing testified, along with Brad Baker, that they also wanted the report on paper and released to the public. And so here's the response to that from NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell.
We did not receive a written report of Ms. Wilkinson's findings for compelling reasons that continue to this day. A critical element of any workplace review is broad participation by both current and former employees. Encouraging employees to come forward and share their experiences, which were frequently painful and emotional, was essential to identifying both the organization's failures and how to fix them. To encourage this participation, Ms. Wilkinson promised confidentiality to any current or former employee. For this reason, shortly after we assumed oversight of Ms. Wilkinson's work, we determined that a comprehensive oral briefing was best to allow us to receive the information necessary, both to evaluate the workplace as it was, and to ensure that the team put in place the policies and processes to reform that workplace, all while preserving the confidentiality of those who participated in the investigation.
Which is not how the NFL has handled these situations in the past. Here's Representative Raha Krishnamurthy of Illinois questioning Roger Goodell.
Now, sir, you had mentioned that the reason for the press release as opposed to a detailed finding, as you had in the other cases, was because of privacy concerns. Isn't that right?
That was one of the issues, yes.
However, I have this 148-page Miami Dolphins harassment report that you did where you have redacted the names of various individuals out of privacy concerns. And so it is possible to release a detailed report and at the same time protect people's privacy, yet you chose not to do so in this particular case with the Commanders.
And it wasn't just the public that was denied the chance to read a detailed report of the NFL's internal investigation. Here's Roger Goodell testifying to Congress on June 22nd.
When the committee has asked questions or requested documents which could violate witness privacy, we have asserted privilege. We will continue to do so to safeguard our commitment.
They refused to give Congress documents as well. And so, instead of fully participating with the congressional investigation, this is what the NFL did about the Washington Commanders situation. This is Roger Goodell.
It is clear to me that the workplace in Washington was unprofessional and unacceptable in numerous respects. Bullying, widespread disrespect toward colleagues, use of demeaning language, public embarrassment, and harassment. Moreover, for a prolonged period of time, the Commanders had a woefully deficient HR function, particularly with respect to reporting practices and record keeping. As a result, we imposed unprecedented discipline on the club, monetary penalties of well over $10 million, and requirements that the club implement a series of recommendations and allow an outside firm to conduct regular reviews of their workplace. In addition, for the past year, Dan Snyder has not attended league or committee meetings, and to the best of my knowledge has not been involved in day-to-day operations at the Commanders. The cheerleader program has been entirely revamped and is now a co-ed dance team under new leadership. And the most recent independent workplace report, which we have shared with the committee, confirms that an entirely new, highly skilled, and diverse management team is in place, and that there has been, quote, substantial transformation of the team's culture, leadership, and human resources practices, end quote.
Let's review that punishment, shall we? So after conducting an investigation that produced no written report, the NFL fined Dan Snyder $10 million. Unprecedented for the NFL. But Dan Snyder's net worth is approximately $4.9 billion. And so to put that fine in perspective, the median net worth for the average American family is $122,000. And so looking at that $10 million fine proportionally for a $5 billionaire, that's like the average American being fined less than $250. Second, the NFL told the Snyder family to implement recommendations. So they told the Snyder family to fix the mess that they themselves created. And then third, there's new leadership for the team. Indeed, this is what the NFL said in their press release. Here's former chair of the committee, Representative Carolyn Maloney.
On July 1st, 2021, the NFL issued a press release announcing the outcome of its investigation into the Washington football team, stating, and I quote, "None of the managers or executives identified as having engaged in misconduct is still employed at the club," end quote.
And some people were in fact fired. But do you want to know who was put in charge of the team at the top? Dan's wife, his wife, was made co-CEO of the team. She wasn't even a replacement. She was made co-CEO with her involuntary soft porn producing husband, Dan Snyder. And under this quote unquote new leadership, the NFL announced that Dan Snyder would, quote, concentrate on a new stadium plan and other matters, unquote, while his wife, Tanya Snyder, would, quote, assume responsibilities for all day-to-day team operations, unquote, for, quote, at least the next several months, unquote. And during those next several months, this is what Roger Goodell testified would be going on.
Earlier this year, the committee heard testimony from several former employees that included new and direct allegations against Mr. Snyder. We promptly engaged former U.S. Attorney Mary Jo White to investigate those allegations. Because those new allegations were brought to the committee in a public setting, we will share the results of that investigation when it is completed, and will take additional disciplinary action if warranted.
It's been 8 months since that testimony, and you want to know what's been released to the public from that investigation? And so all that's been done about Dan Snyder is that the NFL handed him a fine that's equivalent to a parking ticket for a normal person, and the team made some changes under the careful watch of Dan Snyder's wife. But that doesn't quite show how easy the Snyders have had it with the NFL, because since this all went down, the NFL has allowed the Snyder family to buy out their minority partners, which means the Snyder family now has full control over the team. They now have more power over the team than they did before all of this. And the league did not have to allow that accumulation of power. There were real punishments available to the NFL. So, for example, the league owners could have voted to remove Snyder from ownership, an opportunity that they had just this past October, but they didn't do that. The league owners also had the power to suspend Dan Snyder. I see players and coaches suspended for things that happen on and off the field all the time. But for Dan Snyder, fellow billionaire owner, they never suspended him. Not for 1 second. His change in the role in the organization was voluntary, and he is legally and contractually free to go back to running the Commanders' day-to-day operations anytime his family sees fit. And even if the Snyder family ends up selling the team, because Dan Snyder has been offering the team for about $7 billion, which is more than what has been paid for any team in NFL history and is more than 7 times what he paid for it. But even if that's how this story eventually ends, with an enormous profit and an exit from the league, the bigger point is that the NFL owners didn't force that sale. They could have, but they have chosen not to. And that decision, it seems clear to me, was supported at the top of the organization. Here's NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell testifying to Congress.
While I have the microphone, I'd also like to say respectfully that Dan Snyder has been held accountable. As I mentioned in the opening, he faced unprecedented discipline, including financial fines, being removed and away from the team at his request for a period of time, up to the year now already. And secondly, and more importantly, transformation of that organization that has gone on in the last year, which is really important.
The head of the NFL really does seem to think that that punishment was sufficient. And the Republicans on the committee agreed. Here's Representative James Comer of Kentucky, and he is now the chairman of the committee now that the Republicans have taken over the House.
Further, because of the bravery of the women testifying before us today, the culture of the franchise has completely turned around. And I want to thank the ladies for being here today. After the NFL's investigation into the football team last year, Commissioner Roger Goodell levied the highest fine on an owner in the history of the sport and suspended the owner from team's operations indefinitely.
Snyder was never suspended by the NFL.
In addition, the commissioner made a series of recommendations to the team to improve its culture. This week, an independent audit confirmed those recommendations are working. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit the audit for the record.
So because things are getting better now, that means that everything Dan Snyder did before that is just bygones? He doesn't even get suspended or, God forbid, fired, and that's okay? Well, according to the new committee chairman, yes.
Because of the commissioner's leadership, bad actors have been held accountable and the culture at the football team has improved. So why are Democrats utilizing committee resources today to examine an issue that is on the path to resolution and is outside this committee's jurisdiction?
And it wasn't just now chairman of the Oversight and Reform Committee, James Comer, who is dismissing the entire investigation as unnecessary. This was a Republican theme. Here's Representative Yvette Harrell of New Mexico.
Mr. Chair, this hearing is a farce, and we should be looking at inflation, the economy, Afghanistan, the border crisis, and so many other issues that are important to our nation and to our constituents. Instead, we are spending time looking at a single business, investigating it for things that happened a decade ago.
It wasn't a decade ago. The witnesses they heard from worked there as recently as 2019.
And let me restate again, the owners of the team fired those responsible.
Dan Snyder and his wife still own the team.
In fact, the owners paid the largest fine ever imposed by the NFL and was suspended indefinitely from operations.
Dan Snyder wasn't suspended by the NFL.
This roundtable is ridiculous and it is abuse of power.
Here's Representative Byron Donalds of Florida, one of the people that the Chaos Caucus voted for to be the Speaker of the House instead of Kevin McCarthy during that whole circus.
We have a responsibility here of regulating specifically the United States economy when it comes to interstate commerce, to regulating our borders, to actually making sure we coin sound money that we appropriate for the necessary functions of government. But one of the things that the Constitution of these United States actually precludes us from doing is interfering directly in the affairs of individual businesses, no matter how abhorrent they may be.
The third hearing that this committee held once his party took over was about Twitter, a private individual business.
Now, if there's criminality involved, then that is where the justice system, specifically in this case, the civil system, takes those matters.
Well, interesting that he mentions the courts, because since this congressional investigation began, an investigation has been launched by the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia, which was given evidence that was collected by the committee. Regardless, with more dismissals of the importance of Congress's role here, this is Virginia Fox of North Carolina, who looks like the cutest little granny you've ever seen, but is one of the most ruthless political sharks that I've ever seen.
It concerns me that this committee is choosing to spend its limited time having this discussion on the NFL and second-guessing decisions when there are multiple Biden-caused catastrophes that desperately need our attention and oversight. And the witnesses here have begged for us to do something, and nothing is going to happen as a result of this committee. That's cruel to these people.
That's a choice. And the witnesses, these bad bitches who stood up to the NFL, they also stood up to these members of Congress who kept saying these things and dismissing the entire investigation. So after his own speech with similar, this is a waste of our time type talking points, here's Representative Ralph Norman of South Carolina's question to the former commander's employees, which, to Norman's credit, he was one of the Republicans who at least bothered to interact with the witnesses. Many of the others didn't. But his question is going to be answered by Emily Applegate, the former marketing coordinator of the Washington Commanders.
What do you want us to do? What should Congress do? I can't legislate bad behavior to stop it. Just quickly, what would you do?
Thank you for asking this question, actually, because I think it's very important due to the fact that multiple members of the committee has now said that this is not the appropriate venue for us to be sharing this story and that we should be in the courtroom, things like that. You guys have the opportunity to take this issue on, pass legislation that would help other employees throughout the United States be able to report so they have that opportunity to be in the courtroom. And not only the opportunity to be in the courtroom, but then also to find some justice. Because I think we can all agree that a lot of people go through the criminal justice system and they never see any type of justice when it comes to sexual harassment or sexual assault. So until those two things are taken more seriously by Congress, then nothing is going to happen. But that's why we're here today, to ask you to do your job and pass those legislation laws.
Exactly. Because it's Congress that makes the rules that the Justice Department referees. And if Dan Snyder, the owner of a multi-billion-dollar franchise and therefore a member of the lawless class, did nothing legally wrong here, especially in making that video of his employees' private parts without their knowledge or permission, if that's what the reality is in this country, that there's nothing legally wrong with that, then a change to our laws seems to be, at the very least, something Congress should debate. And as for whether or not this is the proper venue for that debate, this is the House Oversight and Reform Committee. Yes, it used to be called the Government Oversight and Reform Committee, but this exact committee has investigated the private sector many times over the years by both parties. Under past Republican leadership, it investigated steroid use by Major League Baseball players. Under past Democratic leadership, it investigated the drug policies of World Wrestling Entertainment. There is nothing unprecedented or inappropriate about these hearings into private sporting organizations. What's different this time is that the topic of this investigation, which the Republicans consider a total waste of time, is sexual harassment, not drugs. And you can read into that whatever you want. But some of the people on the committee who did take this seriously, all of them Democrats, this was a partisan issue, well, they wrote bills in response to these hearings. Here's former Democratic chair of the committee, Carolyn Maloney.
Our first bill, the Accountability for Workplace Misconduct Act, will require employers to conduct thorough investigations and share the outcome with victims, and it will prohibit employers from using non-disclosure agreements to conceal workplace misconduct. One of Dan Snyder's favorite tactics.
But the Accountability for Workplace Misconduct Act died in the 117th Congress without getting a vote.
Our second bill is the Professional Images Protection Act. Our investigation confirmed that the commanders secretly created lewd videos of cheerleaders for the private enjoyment of Dan Snyder. That is despicable, and our bill will create notice and consent requirements for employers who use their employees' professional images.
But the Professional Images Protection Act also died in the last Congress without getting a vote. But that doesn't mean that these bills never stood a chance. I've seen a lot of bills get reintroduced Congress after Congress and creep their way towards law with efforts extending back several Congresses. And had the Democrats retained their power in the House, there were some that were thinking beyond even those two bills when considering what could be done in regards to the NFL. So here's Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida.
You might be aware that part of the reason that the NFL is such a profitable business is that Congress approved legislation in 1961 that allowed an antitrust exemption where professional football teams to pool together when negotiating radio and television contracts. They also receive lucrative federal tax exemptions and taxpayer dollars in the hundreds of millions to build football stadiums that make them billions. Do you believe Congress should be in the business of protecting an organization that puts the interests of billionaire owners above hundreds of women who experienced harassment and abuse? And do you think that those benefits, that we should consider revoking them if they do not make changes to ensure that you have protections when it comes to human resources, sexual assault, accountability, making sure that there is an equitable and safe workplace for their employees?
What do you think? Because an antitrust exemption means that the NFL is a legal monopoly. No competition allowed in professional football. That's a choice that Congress made, and Congress can undo it. There's also a perhaps even more extreme suggestion by Representative Jackie Speer of California.
We could also investigate the tax-exempt status of the National Football League. We gave them that tax-exempt status. Evidently, there was $8 billion received last year that was then divided up among the various teams to the tune of about $250 million a team.
Yeah. Did you know that? In the charities/nonprofit section of the IRS's website, it lists professional football leagues, of which there is one, the legal monopolist, the NFL. The NFL, this blows my mind, is a nonprofit? Only in the twisted DC reality can the NFL be considered a nonprofit. It's a profit-making machine. Now, to be clear here, this is the NFL itself that is legally a nonprofit, not the individual teams. The teams pay taxes. But the NFL, which is in the business of writing the game rules, hiring referees, creating player contracts, organizing the NFL draft, operating youth football programs all over the country, and organizing a small event known as the Super Bowl, well, the organization itself that does all that and makes billions, that's what's the nonprofit. And speaking of profit, $8 billion, which is what Jackie Speer quoted, was a COVID-era profit for the NFL. The NFL made $15 billion in 2019 before the pandemic. Now, to count as a nonprofit, what the NFL does is they take those billions and they hand them out to the teams. Now, the NFL says that they should be tax exempt because they count as a trade organization of the 32 teams. And like a lot of trade organizations, the NFL does spend money on lobbying Congress on behalf of the NFL, spending more than $1 million per year most years since 2007, on top of the NFL's political action committees, which donate money directly to members of Congress. But is the NFL really a trade organization? Like, in reality? Because the trade organizations generally have open membership to anyone in the trade, in this case, any professional football team. But the NFL doesn't have open membership. It's a closed club, only 32 allowed. And it's a closed club just like the NBA and the MLB are professional basketball and baseball leagues, but those are not tax exempt, even though legally they're allowed to be. But as I'm sitting here looking at this, I'm really struggling to understand why the league should be tax exempt. And don't even get me started on the fact that their stadiums are often paid for with tax money. The Indianapolis Colts Stadium, taxes paid $619 million for that stadium. Minnesota Vikings, their stadium, $506 million. The Dallas Cowboys, $444 million for their stadium. The Cincinnati Bengals, $424 million for their stadium. The Arizona Cardinals, $310 million for their stadium. And the Santa Clara 49ers, $116 million for theirs. But there's nothing nonprofit about the NFL, any part of it. Like I said, I love American football. I love being a fan. But my taxes should be for things that everyone needs. Things we all need on standby. Firefighters, policemen, and yes, I think doctors and hospitals should be in that category. But not a single person needs American football. Profit away, NFL, and every one of your teams. I'm helping you profit after all. But not one penny of taxes should be going to support this immensely profitable game. It's a game. This seems like something that Congress, at the very least, should debate. But the 118th Congress won't. This investigation is dead for at least the next 2 years. The bills that could help prevent employees from involuntarily starring in porn and then being silenced about their experiences, those bills are also dead for at least the next 2 years. Because elections have consequences. Because despite what the sit out the vote crowd says, the only way that true power shifts happen in the United States is via our voting. And in the last election, the closest congressional election I've ever witnessed, the House was given to the Republican Party by just 6,675 votes. Had just that many people voted differently in just 5 districts, the Democrats could still have control of the House. A Democrat could still be holding the chairman's gavel in the House Oversight and Reform Committee, and this investigation could continue, and efforts to pass those bills could continue as well. As would the investigation into the Seresto flea and tick collars, which if you love your dog or cat, you should know might be responsible for the deaths of a lot of them. That was another investigation that was completely dismissed as trivial by this same exact group of Republicans. That was also in this same committee, the House Oversight and Reform Committee. The Republicans on this committee and their callousness towards the health of my darling Abby pup and me, because humans are reporting serious illnesses because of the combo of chemicals on those collars too. But the callousness of the Republicans towards that investigation remains unconscionable to me. That was hands down the worst politics over people behavior that I have ever seen in Congress. And I've seen some crazy shit. But they didn't get punished for that behavior. They got rewarded for it. They got more power. They got control of the House because people keep voting for these people no matter what they do. And that's probably because most Americans don't know what they do, which is why this podcast exists. We know what they say, but we don't know what they do because almost no one is watching them at work. No one is watching. Which is what makes what I'm about to tell you feel so impossible to overcome. Because if no one is watching and doing anything to save the investigation into corporate products that are killing puppies and kittens, what chance do I have for creating an internet mob about a government archive? Because these same Republicans, these same humans that dismissed these investigations while they were happening, they got control of Congress, and within a month, these investigative hearings, the commander's hearings, the Seresto pet collars hearings, the archives on their committee website giving information about those and providing videos of those hearings, they're all gone. When you click on the link in the Congressional Dish show notes for the Seresto flea and tick collar investigation hearing, that link goes to an official government webpage that says content not found. And when I went to search for the hearing archives from 2021 and 22 to find these two commanders' hearings official websites, I found the archive empty between June 10th, 2020 and February 1st, 2023. On the official government website of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, it's like the 117th Congress never even happened. 2022 and 2021 don't appear in the drop-down menu. And if you use the calendar function, the entire year of 2022 is now blank. And I can't prove for sure that the Republicans on the committee are responsible for these disappearances. I did reach out to a member of the committee and never heard back because I never do. But that timing is a bit sus, as the youngins will definitely not approve of my old ass saying. But it doesn't really matter, big picture, if it was the Republicans, or if this is all some mistake. Because the point is that the website archives are being changed in tandem with a change in party rule, which pisses me off because it's breaking our show notes. The Congressional Dish show notes, I think, are the most valuable things that I do because they develop trust in our relationship. They let you see things for yourself, and they let me prove that the history that I'm telling you about actually happened. And so when the links I give you no longer work because the hearings have been removed from committee websites or even just moved, even when they move them, it breaks the connections, not just in my show notes, but in the links that all journalists have made to those official government websites. And it's not just links to the hearing videos that break. The documents that get attached to the hearings, those documents disappear too. Now, I know that this could all just be a mistake that happened in the transition. There is a chance that those 2 years worth of hearings could all reappear. But this is a red flag moment for me because it's a symptom of a disease in our Congress that I noticed sometime in the last Congress, which is that I was seeing party names in the committee website URLs, the handles, and the labels. So like the Rock and Play Sleeper hearing. The investigation into the deathbeds for babies that were allowed to be sold to our families for more than 10 years. Well, the official hearing page on the government website with the witness lists and the documents, that's now gone. But we were able to find the hearing video by going to a YouTube page titled Oversight Committee Democrats. But while that would imply that it's a party-owned page, the official website of that YouTube page links to the official government website, oversight.house.gov. We also noticed, or I should say, Claire noticed, that the House Foreign Affairs Committee website has recently been scrubbed of some hearings from the last Congress too. So like 2 of the Ukraine hearings from episode 253, Escalation of War, have been disappeared from the government committee's website. But unlike the clean sweep of all hearings from the 117th Congress that has happened over at the Oversight Committee, House Foreign Affairs website archive is only missing some hearing pages. Others are still there, which I think is actually even more troubling than what the Oversight Committee did. Because at least when you go to the Oversight Committee, like you can't even search in the years 2021 and 2022. But if you go to House Foreign Affairs, it looks like they're still in archive. But somehow selected hearings about Ukraine are gone. And who knows what else? We were just checking our old links, but like what else is missing from there? I don't know. Although I should mention there is a way we could find out because the congressional record lists all of the different hearings that happen every day. And so if you wanted to, you could go into the congressional record and manually check that all of the hearings from each of the days are showing up on the committee archives. I'm not going to do that, but there is a way to see what was deleted. But just like with the Oversight Committee, although the hearing pages with the witness lists and the media links and the documents are missing from the government website, Claire found that the hearing videos are on YouTube, on a YouTube page with the official committee logo and the handle @HouseForeign, but that YouTube page is labeled House Foreign Affairs Committee Democrats. And it's not just the Democrats that are doing this. The Republicans are also taking ownership of committee archives too. So like the links from the last Congress that were going to republicans-oversight.house.gov are now being forwarded to oversight.house.gov. Like the Republicans are now the authors of that committee history because they have the most members. So I know that's a lot of detail. Big picture, what I'm seeing here and what I'm concerned about is that the committee websites, the government websites, are being treated as if they are owned by the Democrats and the Republicans. And they appear to be switching things and breaking the archives when they trade power. What I'm witnessing is that the two parties are treating our government committees like their own private fiefdoms, like timeshare owners that throw away old books left behind in their co-owned condos. But the thing is that unlike timeshare owners, the Republicans and Democrats don't own these properties. They don't own the committees in any way. They are not owners of the committees when they get the gavels. They don't get to choose what stays and what goes. Republicans and Democrats are not owners. They're the help. We hire them to maintain the committees. They are our employees. Those committees are ours. Those hearings are ours. Those archives are ours. They belong to the government, and the government is ours. All of this belongs to us. And the events that we paid for in the past are not theirs to throw away or to claim as their own. And as American taxpayers, we should not allow this. The archive should be sacred. History should be preserved. We deserve an online documentation that is true of our history. And while I love C-SPAN and their mission, we shouldn't trust this to any private entity. Because, it's not even like C-SPAN can maintain a true archive anyway. We know that C-SPAN can't and doesn't film every hearing. The government itself needs to be responsible for maintaining public archives of history. And I want them to be on the internet. They should be on the internet. But if laws exist about the government's responsibilities for maintaining internet archives, I don't know about them. And I think that there's a pretty obvious reason for this, because this Congress is being run by the boomers' parents. That's not exactly the most internet savvy age cohort. There's a lot about internet life that hasn't been legislated. And based on what I'm seeing, right now, the party elders appear to be winging it when it comes to maintaining internet archives. But the problem is, who the fuck is paying attention to the internet archives? No one. Except freaks like Claire and I. And I don't know how to begin to big picture solve this, because it would take an act of Congress, because I'm pretty sure there's not a law about this. And we all know, did you see that State of the Union? I loved it, but this Congress is a circus.
Instead of making the wealthy pay their fair share, some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. Let me give you, anybody who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you a copy. Of the proposal. That means Congress doesn't vote.
I mean, these people prove themselves incapable of listening politely to the President of the United States. Are they going to listen to me and unite to act to preserve the internet archives? My God, my volleyball will sooner grow wings and fly. And so appealing to Congress, that path, feels impossible to me, which means that we need to protect the Congressional Dish archives a different way. In the short term, Claire is, right now, as I speak, replacing as many of these broken links in our show notes as she can find, which, by the way, she started doing without me even asking, which just goes to show how committed and perfect she is for administrating this project. But we don't know how extensive the damage is yet, and playing whack-a-mole in our old show notes is not a sustainable plan, because we don't even know that we'll be able to find replacements for all of the links that are gone, which is kind of a holy shit moment over here, because we need to insulate this podcast from possible biannual archive deletion events. Now, I don't know if these archive deletion events are new or if they've always happened. I don't know if this is a sign that we're just hitting another new low in terms of congressional norms and noticing it in real time. I don't know if the deletions are on purpose or if they're accidents. And I don't know if there are any rules about how government websites are supposed to be maintained. But for Congressional Dish, I think the solution is obvious. We need to create an archive of our own so that this can't affect us going forward. Because if we don't make sure that the full hearing is available for you to watch at the links that we provide in the show notes, then our timestamps and transcripts are also useless, because the whole point is for you to be able to find these clips and watch them in context, to see if we're editing fairly, which is especially important in episodes like Contriving January 6th, when I'm condensing 10 hearings, like 20 hours of testimony, into one 2-hour show. And so that's what we want to do. We want to put the full hearings that we use for sound clips on YouTube. And we're picking YouTube because YouTube is what everyone seems to know how to use, and YouTube is what we know how to use. But also because YouTube makes it super easy to download these hearings and clips to your own devices using all kinds of free software programs. Because the more of us who save the important stuff to hardware to protect them from archive deletion events, the better. And so here's what I'm offering to do. My offer is to create an archive of all the hearings that I use for Congressional Dish, using the description section to give detailed notes about the hearings, what committee held the hearing, the date of the hearing, who testified, a summary of the hearing, and links to stuff, useful stuff. And on top of that, we also want to put videos of a lot of our sound clips into a clip archive. Because right now we use a like half-assed combo of Dropbox and Evernote for our internal archive, for all of our video and audio clips. And that's what we use to search for old ones when we want to use them in episodes that we're working on. But if you are willing to help us level up, we'd love to have our video clip archive be public for you and for everyone with their own internet shows to easily find, watch, and use. And we intend to use the YouTube archive ourselves, and so we're going to be working on making it good. And if it is good, I think that it could be useful for other content creators. Because think about all the people who share information in good faith who need to fill up an hour every day, or at least a few days a week. Like off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Brianna Joy Gray with her podcast Bad Faith, and Brianna and Robbie Suave on Rising. That's a daily show. Crystal and Sauger on Breaking Points are also trying to fill up hours a week of current events topics. The Young Turks, they produce shows daily. The Daily Wire people produce shows daily. Even the mainstream douche mannequins in the corporate media, they use video clips every day. And so what I'm thinking is that if I make a great clip archive for them, that they might use it for their own stories. And maybe on these other bigger shows, a little Congressional Dish logo could sneak onto their programs as well. Because they do want to provide credit to the people they get their sources from. And so I don't think it's a common practice to remove those logos, you know? But we can help generate more interest in what Congress does by making it easier to cover this stuff. And I think that making a useful archive could put this information, but also Congressional Dish, on the radars of larger shows better than any advertisement I could pay for. I think this archive, by being useful, could help market Congressional Dish. And I think we're on solid legal ground to do this, because all of this will be public domain. Not that I would restrict its use if I could. But these hearings, like I said, they belong to us. Any content creator is free to use them in their shows. They are yours. That's one of the original reasons that I ran with this topic for my own podcast, because I knew that no one could claim copyright on the clips that I use if I'm getting them directly from my government. They're all public domain. And the people in Congress seem to have forgotten that. The archives are public domain, not party domain. And I want to help ensure that we have access to as much of our government information as I can. And so I'm motivated to create this archive. I want this to exist. In the same way I wanted Congressional Dish to exist, I'm feeling the drive to make this archive happen. I think it's needed. And I already have the perfect person to create it for us. Claire is a professional archivist who truly gets what we're doing here at Congressional Dish. We are ready. We are ready to start on this project, and in fact already have, because we're trying to get a jump on getting these hearings downloaded before anything else can get deleted. What I need, though, is investors in this project. Because creating our own hearing and clip archive, this is a long-term commitment. It's going to cost me money, not just to build, but to maintain. And we have 888 patrons. And while we are grateful to each and every one of them for letting me afford Claire to begin with, we have 888 patrons, which is fewer than 1,000 patrons committed to paying for each episode. So there's a limit to what we can do. And so, will you please help us pay for this? You can decide how much you want to support this. A lump sum is great. Ongoing support is great. It's all great. Do whatever feels great to you. And we have all kinds of options listed in this episode's show notes and on the support page on congressionaldish.com. From Patreon support per episode to PayPals or paper checks per month or whenever you want. We also accept Venmos and PayPals and Zells for sending in lump sums for whatever works for you. There's so many options. If it works for you, it works for us. But together, I think we can create something really useful for you, for me, for journalists who we wish would focus on Congress more, for the country. Because, you know, as frustrating as it is to discover yet another low in congressional dysfunction under the reign of these two parties, it is an inspiring feeling, don't you think? To know that we can do something about this particular problem. And it's personally inspiring to me that we have already gotten started on this project because we trust that you'll have our backs as we try. Oh, and if you want to check out the progress as we build it, you know, and want to watch some hearings and clips, you can find and follow our archive at congressionaldish.tv. And also, if you have thoughts about the archive and how we're organizing it, Claire is also doing a fabulous job with the Congressional Dish Instagram account. Claire is clearly a super fan of this show. She has listened to all of my archive, I'm pretty sure, because she is finding and posting follow-up news from the old episodes of Congressional Dish. And so I'm finding that the Congressional Dish Instagram is keeping me informed. I love it. And so please follow Congressional Dish on Instagram because, first of all, I think you'll like it, but also because it's a great place to chat with Claire, because we would love your feedback on how the archive is most useful to you and how we can best organize it. And now finally, before I wrap up this episode, I would like to thank a couple of our new executive producers. For those of you who are new to the whole value for value business model that we operate here at Congressional Dish, if you want to be an executive producer, it costs $535 per executive producer credit. When you get one, you get to put your name on an episode of your choice, which serves as your public vouch for that episode. And we are in the process of creating a part of our website that ranks all of the most valuable episodes of Congressional Dish by how many executive producer credits they have. And then also you can go ahead and put that credit on your LinkedIn or anywhere else you want credit for it, because it is a real credit. If you are paying $535 for an episode, that is a significant portion of that episode's producer costs. And therefore, I am proud to have my name alongside yours as having produced it. And so first up, I would like to thank Alex Smith, who is now going to be an executive producer on episode 247, which is the BIF, as in Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, the growth of U.S. railroads. And Alex said, if you find value from Jen's work, contribute. In 2019, President Trump issued a permit opening the possibility of a rail line from Alaska to Alberta. This project could lead to freight and passenger service to the 49th state, giving us more options than just air and ocean freight. Your work shines light on our most neglected logistics network, and I'm hoping one day to ride from Fairbanks, Alaska to Tampa, Florida on a robust rail system. That would be amazing. I'm excited to list my executive producer credit on LinkedIn. Love and gratitude to Jen and the Congressional Dish contributors, from Alex Smith from Juneau, Alaska. Thank you very much for supporting the show. And I also love that episode. I love traveling by train, and I share the dream of one day having a train network which resembles what all the other industrialized countries in the world have. Our country is not that big. We could do it. So thank you so much for supporting the show. And I also definitely want to thank Brandon Lewis, who sent in five executive producer credits all at once, which is amazing. And so the 5 episodes that he has picked to help me co-produce are Congressional Dish 186, the National Endowment for Democracy episode. And I'm pretty sure, we'll see when the graph is done, but I'm pretty sure that brings that episode back into the number 1 slot as most valuable episode, making it tied with Contriving January 6th. So you made a difference there. He also put an executive producer credit on Congressional Dish 252, which is the Women's Health Protection Act episode. He also has an executive producer credit on 257, the PACT Act, Healthcare for Poison Veterans episode. And he said, I was this old when I learned about the Palomar, Spain nuclear accident. Thank you. Yeah, that episode blew me away. I learned about so many instances of the military poisoning people around the world, including their own people, and covering it up. And it was just so wild to go through that new law and be like, wait, why are we paying for healthcare for these people? Like, what happened there? And then to look into the incident and be like, oh my God, we dropped nuclear bombs on Spain. It's crazy. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, I highly recommend it, just to know what our country has done, our military in particular, because I think that there's a good chance it's still happening, because I know that we just had the military poison water accidentally, but it happened in Hawaii. And then, like I said, in the National Defense Authorization Acts that I'm looking into, there's been a lot of talk about these forever chemicals and specifically drinking water. And I haven't looked into that yet, so I don't really know what I'm talking about. but I keep seeing something about poisoned water in defense authorizations. So I'm going to be looking into that. He also put an executive producer credit on the episode 258, the gain of function research episode. And then finally, he has an executive producer credit on Congressional Dish 265, Policing FTX. And he said, reading the news reports and listening to your show, sheesh, scary. Thank you for illuminating this for everyone. And then he also said, Jen, your work matters. I recognize the amount of effort required to produce a show like this is formidable, time-consuming, and draining on a lot of levels. Yes, it is. Thank you. The information you share is valuable for you and your elite team of professionals. Bravo. This is from Brandon K. Lewis of Dallas, Texas. Brandon, thank you so much for supporting the show, especially at this level. And yeah, this show is difficult to do, but I love being able to tell these stories. And so you have helped me do that. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone else who is helping me do this show. The next episode, barring anything crazy happening, should be about the National Defense Authorization Act. It's going to start with a summary of what I found, and then I'll give you some more details on the money and weapons we're going to be giving to Ecuador. What are we doing in this world? So yeah, that should be the next episode. Until then, enjoy your Super Bowl Sunday. Now that I have repented, I'm going to enjoy the game, and I hope you do too. And I will talk to you sometime soon. All right. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.